The wind carried dust across the open Montana plains, brushing tall grass against old fence posts, as the sun sank into a horizon, painted gold and blood orange. And along that lonely stretch of land rode Silas Hale, the quiet, broad-shouldered single dad whom folks in Sagebrush Ridge called the Silent Bull, not because he was mean, but because he almost never spoke, unless absolutely necessary. A habit born from years of heartbreak and responsibilities that twisted a once vibrant man into a figure carved from silence itself. His horse, Ember, moved with a slow confidence as Silas scanned his ranch perimeter, making sure no predators had wandered near the cattle, and he was just about to turn toward home when something tugged at the deepest part of his instincts, a sound too soft to belong to coyotes, too pained to be the wind, an awful, small whimper like someone trying not to cry. Silas paused, narrowing his eyes, and guided Ember toward the sound, the rhythm of hoofbeats echoing through the emptiness until he reached the old abandoned cattle pen he hadn't used in years, a place so forgotten even the sunlight seemed to avoid touching it. And there, tied to the gray, splintered fence with rope digging deep into her wrists, was a young woman slumped forward, her back rising and falling in shallow, trembling breaths, her dress torn, her boots missing. Her hair, tangled like a wild creature, had dragged her through the dust, and Silas' heart, hardened as it was, punched against his ribs with a strange, sharp ache. He dismounted slowly, movements careful as if approaching a wounded fawn. He had been a rancher long enough to know what broken spirits looked like. But this was something crueler, something that stirred his usually quiet temper. The woman flinched when she heard him approach, as though expecting another blow. And Silas spoke, his voice rough, deep, used so rarely that even he felt the weight of it. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said gently, the words soft but steady. And she lifted her head just enough for him to see her eyes, wide, glassy, terrified, and so full of sorrow that it cracked the armor he'd kept around himself for years. He cut the ropes with a swift slice of his knife, catching her body before she hit the ground, and she gasped at the sudden freedom, fingers twitching as if she couldn't believe she could move. She whispered her name after a long pause, "Elara," barely loud, enough for the prairie to hear, and her voice was so faint, so fragile, that Silas felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the instinct to protect someone who wasn't his daughter. As he lifted her onto Ember, she winced, but didn't pull away. And Silas murmured, "You're safe now," words he normally saved only for Lily, his 7-year-old daughter, who had been the only bright spot in his world since the day his wife died. He held Elara steady during the ride back, every bounce of the saddle reminding him how light she was, how starved, how mistreated. When his ranch house came into view, a sturdy, weathered cabin surrounded by rolling fields and fence lines, Lily ran out from the porch, braids flying, green eyes widening, when she saw the strange woman slumped on the horse. "Papa, what happened?" "Who is she? Is she okay?" Lily's voice came fast, worried, her little hands grabbing Silas's, shirt as if by touching him she could make everything safe again. And Silas soothed her with a rare soft smile, lifting Elara carefully into his arms and carrying her inside as Lily followed like a determined shadow. He placed Elara in the spare bedroom, once his late wife's room, untouched for years, doors always closed because Silas couldn't bear to face memories. And as he laid, the frail woman on the bed, the ghosts of his past stirred. But for the first time, it didn't crush him. Instead, he felt purpose. While Lily fetched warm water and a blanket, Silas cleaned the cuts on Elara's wrists, jaw tightening at the rope burns deep enough to scar. She tried apologizing, as if she believed taking up space was a sin, but Silas stopped her with a gentle, "You don't owe anyone an apology for surviving." Days passed as Elara recovered slowly, sleeping long hours, waking trembling from nightmares, eating only when Lily insisted, and gradually her story unraveled between sips of water and weak breaths. She had traveled with a group of settlers who promised her work, shelter, and safety. But the moment they decided she wasn't strong enough to be useful, and they tied her to a fence like a broken tool and left her behind without remorse. Silas's hands clenched so tight he nearly snapped the wooden spoon he was holding. He knew cruelty existed in the West, but this level of disregard for human life made his blood boil. Yet he never showed Ilara that anger, only patience, only gentleness, only quiet reassurance that she didn't have to fear anyone on his land. As her strength returned, Ilara began helping around the house, not because Silas asked, but because she wanted to repay the kindness she wasn't used to receiving. She swept floors, fed chickens with Lily, brushed Ember's mane, and every time Silas watched her move with quiet gratitude instead of obligation, he felt something unfurl in his chest, something warm and dangerous, hope. Lily adored her from the beginning, trailing her everywhere, telling her stories, braiding her hair, slipping her wildflowers at breakfast, and Ilara responded with the kind of tenderness Lily had been missing for years. Sometimes Silas would stand in the doorway, arms crossed, pretending to be checking the ranch schedule while secretly watching them. Lily's laughter filling the house again, Ilara's soft voice humming while mending clothes, and he would feel a tug in his heart he didn't know how to name. But the peace didn't last. One late afternoon, as the sky turned purple with dusk, the thunder of approaching horses shook the ground. Silas stepped onto the porch, eyes narrowing as 5 rough-looking men rode toward the ranch. The same men who had abandoned Ilara. They sneered, shouting that Silas had stolen their worker, demanding he hand her back like she was property. And Silas felt his silence break, not with words, but with a deadly stillness that made even the wind hesitate. He stepped off the porch, broad shoulders squared, gaze sharp with a warning older than the West itself. "She's not going anywhere," he said, voice deep and final. The men laughed, but there was something in Silas's stance that made even the boldest of them hesitate. A man who had buried a wife, fought off wolves, raised a child alone, and carved a life out of unforgiving land, was not someone to test. Before things could escalate further, Ilara appeared behind him, trembling but determined, eyes wide as she stared at the men who once left her tied to die. Silas felt her fear like it was his own, and something primal rose in him, a vow he hadn't spoken, yet but felt in every heartbeat. No one would ever hurt her again. And as the tension thickened in the cooling air, the men prepared to force their claim, unaware that Silas Hale, the silent rancher who rarely spoke, was ready to unleash a storm for the first time in years, especially for the woman who had come into his home. Like a whisper, yet changed everything like a wildfire.